I would emphasize the elements of play and experimentation. As I have experienced more with working with found footage, I realized that archival and found footage had a lot of potentials because they kind of have embedded kind of embedded in their aesthetics and the way that they have been used in the existing material, the kind of ideology that you can play with and maybe subvert. So I guess one of the things that I seem to have been doing in my found footage work was that I would do something to kind of like deconstruct the existing material. I would take elements kind of out of their context. And so it become kind of like just a unit for me to use to build the new story. And the other thing is that I would try to build a kind of a believable story out of the kind of fragments that I use from the existing material. So like in 11 Men, it became a believable story of this woman kind of recounting her experience with different men that she had in her life. So in that way, I could kind of unify all these roles that she had in her career. In Everyday's the 70s, I use like different kind of material that kind of run parallel to each other, but I follow kind of like a chronological order, and all these channels kind of follow the same points in history, so they can kind of run parallel and like reference each other. The thing that I really like about Kafka's story was that it has a very, very simple structure. It's somebody said that his story 11 Sons was actually just kind of like his sketch for the different characters that he would write about in the future. The way that a father describing his sons, always quite critical of all their weaknesses, but you still feel kind of a hint of unconditional love, and that is what I really like. And because the text was so open and ambiguous, it feels like a blank canvas for me on which I could draw with my own material. For me, kind of bring in a different kind of dimension than if you just talk about this man purely from the feminist point of view. I could see that there are parallel stories told by different kind of media, and it was interesting to me to see all these kind of representations of history and memories. I was always very interested in gaps in history, and a kind of alternative kind of archives, and what you would call as history. So I also thought of Kurosawa's film Rashomon, when he told this same story 3 times or 4 times, but by different characters in the film. My first intention was to make it into an installation, because I wanted to be able to show on these different channels in parallel, and I also wanted to experiment with the sound. The way I would install in the space is that you would have separate speakers, and the audience would sit in front of each speaker, and depending on where you sit, you would hear the sound mostly coming from that source. I think sometimes there's also a kind of a difference in between showing work in a gallery space as installation or in cinema, in the way that I feel like the relationship between the audience and the work tend to be more intimate. On the other hand, in the cinema, it's easier to hold the audience attention from the beginning to the end than in the gallery. Because in the gallery, it's just a loop, and the audience can come in and out anytime. And so the logic of the space and the gallery is very different. I guess it's less of a kind of a narrative or storytelling. I've been kind of interested in finding the underlying kind of logics of our world and reality. And unfortunately, I think the way that we function as a society is largely based on the structures of power and patriarchy. So it doesn't really matter what fifth cinema means. I think it's some kind of cinema that kind of at the same time defying categorization, but kind of go beyond these kind of systems of power and nationalism and patriarchy. Actually, before I started to make fifth cinema, I have, by that point, I have accumulated a lot of material and archival material over the years, because I had been collecting footage and materials for works from landscape series and Vietnam the movie, 11 Men, and also the work that I had made on Champa, Letters from Panduranga. That was when I first worked with indigenous people. Beside that, I also had a lot of material and footage that I started to look at a little bit randomly of my personal archives. And one of them was the footage of my daughter. I just wanted to use the footage of her growing up in this project. It was kind of like a passage of time, and she became kind of a stand-in for me, but also she was a kind of an image of the future. And so in between looking back at all this material and reading Barry Barclay's text, I felt a connection. And I thought that his text would help me to unify all these very, very different kind of areas in my interest. We actually had a very limited kind of access to any kind of archival footage in Vietnam. there wasn't much existing, so it wasn't easy to find kind of found footage to work with. So first it was just because cinema was kind of more available as a material. You know, you can buy DVDs, you can download films easily online. So it's about the access. But I grew to appreciate cinema as a potentially interesting material for found footage film, because I think that actually, like, ideology is always being expressed in cinema or in narrative film in a kind of more indirect way compared to documentary films. And also, cinema play a very important role in kind of shaping our society's kind of collective memory. As I mentioned before, my interest was to try to understand and to kind of talk about the system of power structure in general. So gender is a part of this divide, of this structure. So it can be about any group of marginalized or suppressed kind of voices that I have been always exploring, and women obviously was one of them. In Fifth Cinema, I was like drawing the parallel between what the text by Barry Barclay was talking about in terms of the gaze in the existing fiction films that were made with the colonial gaze. So the film that were made of indigenous people traditionally would be shot in his description, would be shot from the ship by the ship officer looking at the indigenous people on the shore. So I was drawing this parallel between that and the gaze that in the Vietnamese society or somewhere else that people would have on the women. There have been this kind of division of how women from the north and from the south of Vietnam have been looked at and described. So the women in the north would be portrayed as hero women fighters, and very patriotic. And in the south, the women have been looked at as women of workers of entertainment. Although it's very different in the way they have been looked at, but similar in the way that they have been used and or instrumentalized. So they don't really have their own voice or agency.